Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. If you could make sure that you're muted as you enter the room, that would be fantastic. We will have a Q&A few minutes probably at the end. Just giving everybody a minute to get in here and we will get started in about 1 minute. I hope everybody has their coffee and their drinks ready to go. Not drinks, but coffee drinks or whatever you need to get you going this morning. Okay, well, it looks like our waiting room has slowed down a little bit, so I am going to go ahead and kick us off this morning. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's training on risk mitigation for small business. Today's webinar is a production of the Virginia Small Business Development Center. Through 29 centers across the Commonwealth, the SBDC provides training and technical assistance to small businesses. The Virginia SBDC is headquartered at George Mason University and is a program that is a cooperative agreement between the U.S. Small Business Administration, premier institutions across Virginia, and our local governments. My name is Stephanie Keener, and I am the Executive Director for the Virginia SBDC, which serves the city of Lynchburg, Amherst, Appomattox, Bedford, and Campbell counties. We're locally hosted at the Lynchburg Regional Business Alliance in downtown Lynchburg. You can see our other upcoming webinars at virginiasbdc.org or sbdclynchburgregion.org. Today's webinar topic is assessing risk, and next month's topic is using what we've learned to build your risk mitigation plan. And this is the first in a two-part series with facilitator Jennifer Woofter and Bill Bond. We're working to add some more titles in the coming weeks, so stay tuned. And before you ask, we will be making slides and a recording of today's webinar available. And you can find past events at sbdclynchburgregion.org or virginiasbdc.org. Bill Bond is the Chief Operating Officer for Sobus, Inc., a small business located in Lynchburg and Fredericksburg, Virginia. For the past 18 years, he has supported communities and projects around the world with hazard and climate change risk assessments, including over 30 hazard mitigation plans in the U.S., conducting risk assessments for natural hazards and identifying potential mitigation hazards, and identifying potential mitigation actions. He's worked with organizations around the globe, including World Bank and the International Finance Corporation. He supported the development of the Central Virginia Hazard Mitigation Plan and the Community Resilience Course for the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center, the Coastal Climate Change Adaptation Course for NOAA's Coastal Services Center, and was an author of the World Bank's Community Reconstruction Handbook. Jennifer Woofter is a sustainability consultant and a small business coach. She actually coaches small businesses here with us at the Lynchburg Regional Business Alliance, at the Virginia SBDC, the Lynchburg region. Over the last 2 decades, she has worked with hundreds of organizations ranging from startups to Fortune 500 companies to hone their business strategies, responding to changing market demands and improving profitability. As a judge in the Mentor Capital Network's annual Sustainable Business Plan competition, she was determined to be in the top 10% of more than 200 judges based on the entrepreneur's rating of her feedback on issues like overall value, immediate use, and novel ideas. Jennifer is the president of Strategic Sustainability Consulting. So If you have any questions during the presentation, type those questions in the chat window. We will facilitate those questions during the Q&A. Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you as I have a few more people coming in the waiting room. We'll see folks popping in. Good morning, Bill and Jennifer.
Good morning. Great. Thanks so much, Stephanie. I'm excited to do this. This is the first course for SBA that I've done. So this is kind of new. And although I've done a lot of courses in the past, it's nice to be able to focus on Virginia and kind of our hazards and bringing in some of that local information. So excited to do this course. As Stephanie mentioned, this is one of two. So today we're going to basically focus on risk, assessing your own risk, and looking at the folks who have signed up for this course. We have businesses from all over the Commonwealth, as well as different types of businesses too. So retail and farming, agriculture, and the service-based industry. We kind of created this course to be flexible, so that all of you can gain something out of it. We mentioned that the mitigation plan is kind of what we're moving towards, but we also want to talk about how to actually implement some of these things with funding, with grants, and that sort of thing. So we'll talk about that more next time. But that's kind of where we're trying to get to is identifying those risks, creating a plan so that you can overcome those risks, and then actually looking to implement as well. If you have a plan, that's great, but we want to actually implement stuff too. Let's see here. So a little bit on the agenda for today. We had a little introductions already. Looks like we've got 20 some, maybe 25 folks or so on the call. So we might have some time to just kind of briefly talk introductions from you all to see kind of who's here, where you're located, what your business is, so that I can kind of refer back to that during the class. I'll talk about some of the materials that we've got here. In this class, we actually developed a little bit of a worksheet, spreadsheet, which Stephanie sent out this morning. We updated it this morning. That will help us kind of go through and document what we're doing today. I'll talk a little bit about risk terminology. A lot of these risk and vulnerability terms get used a lot, sometimes interchangeably when maybe they shouldn't be. So we'll talk about some of the terminology we're going to be using today up front. And then we'll get into that risk assessment, which will be the most of this course today. So we'll talk about looking at your own businesses, identifying those assets and dependencies, and then looking at potential impacts to your business. What's kind of your worst fear, and maybe thinking about things that you might not have thought about before. In terms of, if I'm dependent on a certain utility or a certain route, and that's impacted, what's that going to do to me? And then looking also at some climate change impacts as well. It's not just going to impact kind of our coastal areas, but we also have impacts here inland as well. So we'll talk about that for Virginia. And we'll take a little break, and then we'll get into more of the workshop or the worksheet, where we'll actually go in and enter in some of that information, those impacts. And then we'll have kind of that finalized impacts of our business. And we really want to quantify those impacts. When we start to look at mitigation and reducing those impacts, all the people who are not impacted, the economic value that is not, is going to be recovered, all that kind of becomes a benefit for when we start looking at benefit and costs. And those are also kind of first steps if you want to actually move forward with requesting, federal grant money and that sort of thing. So we do want to really quantify those risks. I know a lot of kind of intro to risk courses we are kind of higher level, but we really want to get down into kind of some of the weeds here and figure out kind of what is at risk in your business. So what I want to do is just kind of go through. Looks like there's 26 people and 3 are instructors. So it shouldn't take too long. Maybe just 20 seconds each or so. Just you know talk about your name, the organization you're representing, where you're located as well. So where in Virginia are you? Um, and maybe just one expectation. What are you expecting to take away from this course? I think what I'll do is maybe unmute people one at a time, so that you can basically give us that information. So let's see here. All right, you'll see that you're going to become unmuted. So when that happens, go ahead and give us your name, organization, location, and just one expectation.
Hi, my name is Trifania Osei, and I am the owner of Elegant Granny LLC, and most people refer to me as Elegant Granny as a public figure of that company. What I do is I support victims and survivors of abuse as they transition from their toxic relationship. And I also have resources for their supporters, their friends and family, to help them transition sustainably. And what I expect is to learn what the risks are that could affect my company, which will ultimately affect my clients so that I can better prepare for it.
Great. Thanks so much. All right, let's move on here.
Hi, this is Scott Vincent, and my husband and I are the owners of the Good Earth Peanut Company in Skippers, Virginia. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, we've been doing this. We're starting our 32nd year. We have a retail store, and we also manufacture all of our nut products. We ship them out all over the country. So there's lots of different risk for our company. We have things coming into us, chocolate and different products that we are using when we're preparing our nuts in our kitchen. And then we have people coming in our store, in our retail store, from all over, driving up and down Interstate 95. So I just need to see what our risks are. And I think I know a lot of them, but I just want to be well informed so that we know how to move forward.
Great. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
What we're going to do is just pick up probably about 5 more or so, and then those we don't get to, if you could just type in your information in the chat, that would be great.
Hi, my name is Darwin Reyes, so I'm here because even though we're not a company yet, we took the ICAP virtual cohort in July. I'm an inventor. And I do research, and along with the entrepreneur lead, we both took the ICAP. As I mentioned in July, she couldn't make it to this important seminar, but since we're still not a company and we're trying to figure out how we're gonna do things in the near future, I I guess my expectations are to learn everything I can from this, today, because I really know nothing about it. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I'm David Meeks with Nasati Vineyards. We're in Ridgeway, Virginia. I'm part owner, and my expectation is to learn all I can on the business side, as I am the grower, and my brother, he's the winemaker.
Great. Thanks so much.
Did it work? Hi,
There we go.
this is Dana Olson, and we are a micro sourdough bakery and goods, make all kinds of hummuses, pestos, pastas, all kinds of different of items. And I'm in Purcellville, Virginia.
Great.
My expectations to learn, I'd really like to ditto the lady Scott Vincent that came before. I am eager to learn everything that I can. Of course, I feel slightly nervous that there are lots of things I may not know, and really want to be educated. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. All right, Mr. Bostic.
Good morning, yes, sir. Introductions, name, organization you're representing. Um, More or less organization. Is that like the company that you're
Yeah.
representing?
Right.
Okay, okay. My name is Daquan Bostic. Organization I'm representing is Quantum Freight Logistics. Job title is a owner operator of a trucking company. Workshop expectations to learn more about business and opportunities that um, with anything that's business related, more or less, and structuring, maintaining, and uh, staying in business, I guess, more or less.
Great. All right. So what I'm going to do is, if I didn't unmute you and you want to share your information, feel free to put that into the chat, just so we're kind of recognize the time we've got. We only have the 2 hours, and I know some of you are kind of doing other things while you're on this as well. So what we'll do is, feel free to share your information in the chat box, and we'll make a note of that at the break. So let me go ahead and kind of move on to more of the lecture here, more of the material. So this this course basically has like three things. We have the slides I'm going to go through with some of the technical content. We also have kind of a one-page resource guide. So this will have some websites on it that will be of interest to you. They're kind of specific to Virginia, and most of them, some are US based as well. But you can kind of go on there. You might have to plug in like your, business address and that sort of thing, but it'll give you more information on specific hazards, as well as local resources for you. Everyone here is from Virginia. So everyone has a local hazard mitigation plan in place, and we'll talk about where to find that and what it contains a little bit later on. We also have worksheets too. So we've created a couple of worksheets, 3 for this class, and we'll have some more for the mitigation class. And this will give you a chance to put in your own specific information for your business, and we'll have you kind of work through. There's some kind of logic in these worksheets. So as you plug in the numbers, it'll start giving you some help on, maybe what hazards to look at, and then also what sort of risks you have, economic risks and that sort of thing. So one common question I have is, what is risk? What is vulnerability? So I try to kind of identify that up front. um, so this is kind of the FEMA definition. It's kind of general, so I like it. But what we're looking at here are kind of your business assets. These could be your employees, your customers, yourself, as well as the infrastructure, the buildings, equipment, vehicles, and it could also be sort of the natural environment as well. So if your business is dependent on the natural environments, on parks, maybe you rent bicycles along a parkway, that could be considered an asset as well. If something were to happen to that, it would impact your business. And then there's the other component is the hazard itself. So, where do these hazards occur? How strong can they get? What are some of the previous occurrences? And then also looking at what's the future probability of these occurring. Is it going to happen more often in the future? So risk kind of takes these two components and brings them together. We overlay our hazard information on our assets to kind of figure out what the potential impacts are going to be to our businesses. The other question I get a lot is, what is vulnerability? A lot of people use the term vulnerability, and they use it the same way they use risk. But there is a little bit of a difference here. With vulnerability, we are looking at those same assets for your business, for your people. But we're looking at hazards, and not necessarily how likely those hazards are going to occur, but how those hazards are going to impact you. So you might think of this as sort of like a susceptibility. So how susceptible is your business to a drought or to a flood? But it's not really looking at how often that flood or drought is going to occur. And the vulnerability assessments are great for things that might not have occurred recently. So things like human-caused disasters that may not occur very often, or even before we had COVID, it was pandemics. Pandemic of this size really had an impact us for quite a while, and it's difficult for us to assign a likelihood to that if it just hasn't occurred very often. But it may be necessary to do a vulnerability assessment if we have very high impacts due to that particular hazard. So you can look at things, as risk and as vulnerability. For this course, we're going to kind of focus on that risk and trying to assign likelihoods to these events. Just to help kind of prioritize kind of what we should be looking at. But a vulnerability assessment can also be very important to a business. So some information on the hazard part of our risk assessment. There are different characteristics of the risk that we want to look at when we're doing a risk assessment. A big one is location. So if we're next to a river, like we're here, I'm actually downtown in Lynchburg right now, we're next to the James River. If we're close enough to that river, we may have to look at the flood hazard at location. Other hazards though can kind of cover the entire area. We could have snowfall in the entire region. We could have a hailstorm or sleet. So there are some hazards like flooding and landslides that are very location specific. If you're next to a cliff or very steep elevation, you may want to look at landslide hazard. So that's something that we're going to look at as well, is identifying those hazards that will be specific to our business location wise, and also the extent and magnitude as well. What has occurred historically. Certain things are very likely to occur, things like flooding. We might get that even every year in certain areas. But hazards like an earthquake, they don't happen as often here in our region. There are some places in Virginia, though, that do have a higher earthquake risk. And something like an earthquake, if it does occur, it could do pretty massive damage. So we do want to also look at these kind of low likelihood, high impact events as well. And looking at kind of previous occurrences is a great way to start to organize that information. You know, how much data is there for a particular hazard? You know, we have now in this country, we have you know, close to 100 years of recorded events, and within the last 50 years, it's really detailed data. You know exactly, we know exactly where this occurred and what they did. So it's important for us to kind of look at some of that information. And then we also need to start looking at future conditions as well. You know, a lot of times our hazard information is only looking at these previous occurrences and is not looking at how the environment is changing. You know, we are starting to see more flash flood events, more heat waves. So we need to think about, you know, drought conditions. We need to look at some of these future conditions as well and how that may impact the business. So this is when we talk about characterizing the hazard, these are the things that we're going to look at when we start to do that. And luckily, a lot of this stuff has already been done for us. It's just a matter of trying to figure out where it resides. You know, what website can I go onto and figure out, you know, what are my impacts. There's a couple of different modeling that's used as well. So these are terms that get used a lot for risk assessors, and this is just to give you kind of a little idea of kind of what those mean. So when I say we're looking at a deterministic event, that is like a real, actual single event that has occurred. So if we had a hurricane that came through and hit Virginia, that hurricane name would be our deterministic event. Or if there's a historic event that we had, that would be a deterministic event. Now, when you start to look at what's called a probabilistic event, this is going to be looking at kind of what is likely to occur in an area. So you see this a lot, you know, if you've bought property and they've done a flood assessment for you, and they say you're in the 100-year floodplain, right? That term is often kind of misunderstood. A lot of people say, you know, oh, we had the 100-year flood, we're pretty good for 100 years, but that's not the case. The terminology they should be using is the 1% annual chance event. Okay, so that means you have a 1% chance event that occurs, and it could happen, you know, this year, it could happen next year, it could happen the year after that in some cases. And it's based on historical data. So they look at all the river levels in your area or the coastal levels in your area for a certain amount of time, and they predict, okay, this is what the 1% water level looks like. FEMA also has what they call the 500-year event. Okay, so it doesn't happen as often as the 100. It's also the 0.2% chance event, and that also gets developed looking at this historical data. So the problem that they sometimes run into is that if you only have data for like 10 years or even 20 years, and you're trying to predict what is the 1% chance, the 100-year event, you may be underestimating the event itself. So it's helpful to have a very long period data set to generate this probabilistic hazard. It also does not look at future conditions. So that 100-year FEMA map does not look at future conditions. It is only historical conditions. Okay, so that can also be an issue that we're seeing across the country. You know, in some areas we get, you know, larger events that have historically just not happened. And this is where we start talking about statistics and that sort of thing. You know, if you have like a 20-sided die and you're rolling it, and you roll it, you know, 20 times, you'll have a sense for kind of what your lows and what your highs are. If you would roll that die 100 times, you'd have a better sense for what your low value is, a 1, compared to your high value, a 20. If you're only going to roll the die like 5 times and you get a 2, 3, 5, and 10, is 10 really your highest, or is 20 really your highest? You just don't know because you don't have the data. So this is kind of how statistics fit into this probabilistic hazard assessment, and why you really should look at some of the background before taking things as truth, I guess. So that's kind of the difference between the deterministic assessment and a probabilistic assessment. It is great to do a probabilistic assessment if you have the data. And what we're going to do in this class is actually look at people who have already done that assessment for us, and we're going to try to take that information and use it ourselves. So I mentioned kind of the asset part of our risk, looking at the people. So this could be our employees, ourselves as the business owner. It could be a customer. It could be tourists or visitors who are maybe customers as well, who may not be knowledgeable of the area and may be particularly susceptible to certain hazards if they're not from this area. Vulnerable populations as well. If your customer base is elderly or children, maybe a daycare or something like that, you should think about special circumstances. You should put information in your plan to make sure that you serve these populations. Also, pets and other animals, that can be part of the business. If maybe you allow your employees to bring their pets to work, or maybe you deal with animals, you're a vet or something like that for your business. So making sure pets have special needs during a disaster, and making sure that you've thought about that in your plan is going to be important. We also have kind of the built environment, so the stuff, the stores, the offices, your place of business. So this could be things like equipment or vehicles, supplies, materials. So kind of everything that could be at risk. Also identifying things that might be perishable, so have a certain shelf life. If you're out of business for like a week, all that perishable stuff is not, if you can't get it to a market, then that's going to be a loss for you. And then also looking at things like utilities. Are you dependent on electricity, on water, gas, those sorts of things as well. Certain events are going to impact your utilities. You might not have electricity. If you have a wind event come through, you may lose electricity. So what are you going to do there? Or your product may depend on water, and you're on city water, and maybe there's a drought going on, and there's water restrictions. So that could be an issue as well. And then transportation too. So if your business depends on getting from one place to another, using roads, bridges, rail, airport, ports, we need to think about kind of expand and look at those dependencies as well. If we use a certain route, interstate, all the time, we also want to make sure we include that in our risk assessment, looking at that route and making sure that do we have another option? Are there susceptible bridges on that route? So we can look at that as well. And then there might be other things too. This is more general, but for your specific business, you may have other either dependencies or equipment, specialty stuff that you want to make sure that you include when we do the risk assessment and we start to evaluate these. And then, like I mentioned, the natural environment too. Are there certain things that you're dependent on as a business? Trails, parks, maybe the river itself. You have a boating company or something like that. So these things as well, you'll need to make sure that you include in your risk assessment if you're dependent on these things. So that's looking at our assets, and we'll jump into our worksheet here in a little bit and start to kind of identify those things for our own community. So what is this risk assessment that we're talking about? So this is going to be a kind of a product. We're going to go through this process where we're going to collect information about our business. Those are going to be the assets that I just mentioned. So the people, employees, customers, the stuff that's at risk, and then any sort of natural environment as well. We're going to identify those things, and we're going to start to assign values to them as well. So what would happen if we did lose this? How much would it cost to replace? So we'll talk a little bit about replacement values. And this is going to help us figure out what our impacts are going to be. And there are going to be some hazards that, might just totally destroy our stuff, or there might be some hazards that really don't impact those things at all. So we really have to, when we look at our assets, we have to look at it like hazard by hazard. And then we can start looking at, where are the greatest impacts going to occur. And in the next workshop, we'll talk about kind of what courses of action can we take to mitigate those impacts. And there's several different applications for risk assessment. In this workshop we're doing, in workshop 2, we're going to look at mitigation. Mitigation, basically you need the risk assessment to kind of justify some of your mitigation measures, to figure out kind of what could happen before you jump into mitigation. There's also, response planning, and this could be a mitigation measure as well. So, making sure you have a response in place. Could be a continuity of operations plan that you develop as well. So what would happen if this hazard occurred, and what can I do in my business to make sure that I can continue, making money in my business. You can also look at things like exercise development. So once you have a plan in place, if it just sits in your computer and you forget about it, it's not really doing anyone any good. So what can you do to make it fresh for everyone? And you can actually do exercises. There's exercises that your local government does. And there's nothing that says that you can't go to that government and get involved in what they're doing and looking at their plans and saying, hey, I want to be part of this exercise. Or you can develop your own exercises with your employees and say, okay, we're going to exercise for, and we do this all the time with fires, right? With urban fires. We have lots of fires that occur every day in this state. And we have fire drills, right? Well, you can create drills and exercises for other hazards as well. What happens if we have a dam failure and we're downstream from a dam? Do we have a plan in place for that? What are we going to do if we only have 20 minutes to evacuate? So these things you can develop for yourself and actually exercise them, as a company. And then community plans are out there too. We'll talk about some of those later this morning. So what community plans are already available that we can kind of look at and maybe take from? We have our hazard mitigation plans locally at our county and our city level, town level even. And we can look at what the community is planning for and how they're planning to mitigate some of those hazards. And there's also emergency operations planning that goes on at the local government level, continuity of government planning. So we can look at some of these plans that are public, and we can see what maybe we can take from their plans. This is what insurance companies use as well for assigning the premium that you're going to pay monthly for your insurance. Okay, they look at what's at risk, and then what's the likelihood of that risk occurring. The government might look at grant funding dispersal. We'll talk about that a little bit in the next workshop, but there are grant funding opportunities available for small businesses from the federal government, but it is a competitive process. And if we go through all these steps for the risk assessment and really quantify our losses, we have a better chance of getting some of that funding here in Virginia. We also have our climate change adaptation plans, and more communities are doing this now as well. especially if you're on the coastline, if you're on tidewater, you probably are already covered with an adaptation plan. And this is where communities have actually looked at, future scenarios. What is it going to look like 20 years from now or 50 years from now? And has started to plan for those eventualities. What is the sea level rise going to do in our communities? The increased storminess and that sort of thing. So there are adaptation plans available in some communities now as well. And then also resiliency planning is a new thing. There's some new ones in the Commonwealth. I know Charlottesville has one now, but there are other communities in Tidewater that have resiliency planning too. So this is something where the community is looking at ways to kind of bounce back better from disasters, and part of that is implementing mitigation measures to make sure the community can do that. So there's lots of applications of risk assessment. This is the one we're talking about here is just kind of one of those steps. So kind of the first thing we want to do with our risk assessment here is just look at our business information. So we've got a spreadsheet here that you can kind of work along with me. But I've got an example retail business in the worksheet slide here. And so if you open up that spreadsheet, it's called Worksheets. Stephanie sent it to you this morning, the updated one. You'll see at the bottom, you've got different worksheet number 1, worksheet number 2, worksheet number 3. You got a couple of references here as well. And so we're going to just start with worksheet number 1. And we're going to work through that with our own business. So we'll start with, of course, the business name and the type of business. You'll see some of these things are drop downs as well. So try to select from that drop down. It may not be exactly what you do, and I know some of your businesses may be more complex. You may have a retail store, but you may also have like an agricultural field. So you may actually have multiple businesses, and in those examples, you may want to actually fill this out for all your business entities. So do one for your retail store, do one for your agricultural fields, that sort of thing. That's fine. So going down through here, talk about your number of employees there. Do your employees work on site? Do your customers need to get on site? So this is just starting to identify information about your own business. Do you and your employees work from home? It might be never, maybe sometimes, maybe always. And then also, after you do that, getting down into quantifying your assets. So do you all rent or do you own your own property? What is the rental that you are paying per month, or maybe it's a mortgage? And then the size of your structure, what your store is, how many square feet. And this could be, if you have multiple stores, just combine it into one large value. So if you have 3 or 4 stores, just combine those into one value. And then separating kind of those perishable values, how much value is kind of on your shelves at a time, or how much perishable inventory do you keep? And this could be an average as well. I know some times a year maybe you have a lot more than others, so trying to get to kind of that average. Agricultural values, and then average gross revenue per year as well. So how much revenue do you pull in an annual basis, and then looking at wages as well. So what are you paying your employees per year as an annual wage? Plugging that information in there as well. So this will help us start to quantify kind of what is at risk. And so we're trying to get to an impact value. You know, if we are out of business for a week, let's say we have a flood here and our business is actually physically impacted. So we're going to have a physical impact to our structure itself. Okay. And it might be not much structural damage, but maybe it's a lot of content damage because it's a flood. So we lose a lot of content value. And then we're out of business for like a month, 30 days. We are not bringing in, we have reduced revenues. We have lost stuff, inventory in the store itself. And then the people we're paying, well, we can't pay, maybe we're not paying them. And then maybe even if it's bad enough damage, you know, the landlord maybe is not bringing in rent anymore as well. So all these things help us kind of figure out kind of worst case impacts with a specific hazard event. Okay, so this is why we're getting into some detail here, because when we start to look at costs avoided, we're not just looking at kind of the physical impacts, we're looking at all these business interruption impacts. And so anything we can do to mitigate that, we look at kind of before and after mitigation. So before we have all these impacts, and after mitigation, we should have less impacts. And that losses avoided becomes our benefit for our benefit cost analysis. So we want to make sure that we quantify everything. So if we have a lot of business interruption, we need to make sure that we capture that, okay? Because that is going to help justify spending money on mitigation. Or if we're submitting a grant application, it's better justifying give me the money versus someone else. Okay, so that's why we get into kind of this level of detail with the assessment. And for some hazards, the business interruption may be the entire loss. You know, it may not be a physical loss to the store itself. Okay, then we also get into some of the dependencies as well. So is your business dependent on electricity? If so, you know, do you have like a backup generator for your business, or do you have solar power? Is there something you can go to if you lose power? And the same with water as well. Are you dependent on water? Maybe you have your own well system, so you may be okay, but if you're dependent on maybe city water, that could be an issue. And is there a redundant system there as well? And you'll see, you know, some of these things could be mitigation itself. So if you are dependent on electricity and you don't have a generator or solar, and we start looking at these impacts, that could be justification for buying a generator. Okay, so if you have your business interruption loss without a generator, and you have no business interruption loss after you use your generator, okay, that loss avoided is your benefit, and the cost of the generator, if it's much less than your losses avoided, then that's probably a good investment for you. Okay, so also looking at some of the supplies, products that require roads, rail, airports, and are there other dependencies as well that you should take a look at? Okay. Let's see. Just checking the chat to make sure there's other questions here, but feel free to, you know, as you're filling this out, and if you don't fill it out now, that's fine. You know, what I would like to do though is have this filled out before our workshop number 2 next month. So you know, take some time between now and then to kind of go through and fill out this information. And if you do have questions, I have my email will be on the last slide, so you can just email me questions you might have, just in case maybe something's not clear. Or as I said, this is the first time we're doing this course, so I created these worksheets just for this course. So if there is, I tried to do some quality control on it, but if there is an issue, you know, just let me know, and we'll make a fix. So that's kind of the first worksheet. It's kind of to think about our assets and our employees. Before I move on, were there any general questions, if you want to type that in the chat, feel free to do that. But pretty straightforward. We're trying to quantify our assets at risk, and to start looking at that. What is at risk? So is that part of the risk equation? Okay, so our next thing that we're looking at here is the hazard itself. So we have information now on our inventory, on our people, on our products at risk. And so now it's going to be a matter of, okay, now we need to look at the hazard. How is the hazard going to impact our assets? Okay, and these are just some examples here of different impacts. Homes damage could actually impact your business. If you have an employee whose home is damaged due to an event, that employee will not be going to work. They're going to be dealing with their own stuff, and that could be an impact for you. Not a direct business structure impact, but kind of an indirect impact. Then we also have structural impact to your business itself. If you're in a floodplain, or if you're on a steep cliff, hopefully not, or if you're in kind of loose soils as well, could amplify some earthquake damage or that sort of thing. There are structural impacts that your building may take. There are tornadoes, could be hurricane winds. Those all produce kind of structural impacts to your buildings. We also have transportation impacts. So if we have roads and bridges and rail that are impacted, we want to make sure that we identify those as well. So in Central Virginia, what we did was we looked at some of the bridges are much older, and the Virginia Department of Transportation kind of identifies those bridges that are older and more likely to be impacted. So sometimes it's a matter of kind of going into some of that data and looking at your routes and saying, okay, I have a 100-year-old bridge on this route that is on a river that floods quite often. That might be an issue that I identify and say, okay, what's my alternative route? Maybe there's a better bridge or a better road to get through. There's also utility impacts as well, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, but if we're dependent on a utility, we need to make sure that we should think about not only the utility coming into our own business, but within some areas around the state, you actually have things like substations in the floodplain, or a water treatment plant that may be impacted. So what happens if that occurs? If you don't have electricity because the substation is underwater, what are you going to do about that? And trying to figure out how long you're going to be without electricity. How is that going to impact business? So it's important to look at these other things as well. Everything that you're dependent on, you should think about what could go wrong, and what are the impacts going to be when that does occur. So I've got a couple of impacts in the Central Virginia area right now, but these are pretty common throughout the Commonwealth. This is a tornado damage. Tornado it's smaller than a hurricane, but the damage it does is quite catastrophic to individual structures. And there are some parts of Virginia that actually tornadoes occur more often than others. So if this is something that occurs quite often, and also looking at your business itself. So if you're working out of manufactured buildings, those are pretty hazard prone. If your office does not have a cellar or basement, what if a tornado does occur? Where are you going to seek shelter? If you have a bunch of tourists that are there and they don't know what's going on, do you have a place to put them? So when you start to identify these hazards, it's important to think about, okay, what are going to be the impacts to me that may be unique from other businesses? So tornadoes, one that's going to impact basically everyone in the Commonwealth has had a tornado come through their county or at some point in time. It doesn't happen as often, like I said, but it is a catastrophic event when it occurs, and you have loss of human life, um, as well as pretty major structural damage. You also have things like uh, there are some roadways that just get flooded all the time. And it happens quite often in coastal areas. You have a lot of nuisance flooding from high tide, king tide, but you also have places inland where you've got the road is flooded. The police might show up and put a barricade up, and you can't get through. So this means your employees might not be able to get to work. Your customers may not be able to get to your store, or your product may not be able to go out because the route is shut down. So thinking about looking at your routes and also looking at the floodplain itself in the community will help you get an idea of what some of those routes may be that get flooded quite often. So we'll talk about where to find some of that information here in a little bit. You might also have something like train derailment. So what is your proximity to rail? Things like hazardous material release can occur with train derailment. It can also happen with a truck accident. So if you're near a highway and you have a lot of tractor trailer traffic, an accident there can cause a spill, and at that point they shut everything down for quite a while. So, what would that do to your business if things are shut down, transportation was shut down, or maybe you couldn't even get to your business because you're adjacent to the train track? So that could be an impact as well. I think we're all kind of dealing with the COVID impacts right now. I think a lot of us have taken mitigation measures. Over the last several months, this has kind of been a kind of a rude awakening. I don't think anyone was kind of thinking this was going to happen during our lifetime, but here we are. And all these things that they're doing now are mitigation measures. Unfortunately, it's kind of taking kind of trial and error. And, if we had a plan in place beforehand, we would be able to say, okay, go to the COVID plan, go to the pandemic plan, and we can then kind of implement these things immediately. So hopefully moving forward, we can kind of take a lot of lessons learned from this and put them in our plan, in our hazard plan, and say, okay, we've dealt with that. We kind of know what we can do to kind of be a sustainable business. But things like this, can occur with other hazards as well. Just because you haven't experienced it yourself doesn't mean it's not going to occur. And so this is where, looking at something more like a vulnerability assessment might be something that you do if it hasn't occurred in your community in quite a while. And we also have, of course, impacts to the agriculture as well. I know some of you all are farmers, and this is going to be, a real loss. If there's hail or there's flooding, if the floodwaters stay around for quite a while, you can have basically a total loss in your crops. And this can also impact you as a store owner as well. If you can't get your produce from your farmers to sell because there's been a large event, what's your plan there? What are you going to be able to do? One thing that we don't always think about as well when we start to plan for these hazards is the debris collection. Okay, so after an event occurs, whether it's flood or tornado or wherever you have a lot of damage, you've got all this debris that needs to be collected, and if debris is just sitting around in your stores and your businesses, then you're not doing business. So there's kind of a point where if there's so much massive damage that you just basically pick up shop and move to a different location because it's just more cost effective to do that. But there may be a chance for you to kind of plan for this. If you know somebody who has a chainsaw who can do some cutting of the trees in front of your business, talking to that person ahead of time and making sure that, hey, if this does occur, what is going to cost for you to come out and clear some debris for me? I want to get on your plan now because I know you're going to be in high demand when this occurs. So talking to these people up front and even putting a contract out and making these folks contractors for you can help out after disaster. You'll be kind of ahead of the game because everyone will be scrambling, trying to figure out what to do. And you'll already know, like, okay, I've identified this crew ahead of time. They've got all these trucks. They can help me remove stuff so I can get going again. So that's another example of, thinking about these other impacts that you're going to have to deal with after the events and planning and making sure you have things in place to actually deal with some of this stuff as well. Okay, so also looking at, there's different ways we can kind of categorize hazards. And some hazards are going to be pretty similar. So if we're looking at things like flooding or dam failure, we have water impacting our structure, impacting our community. Those are going to be similar impacts. So if we mitigate for our riverine flooding here, that mitigation may also be used for things like stormwater flooding or dam failure, where we have the same sort of impact. So the more hazards that we can kind of mitigate with our whatever we're planning to do, the better off we'll be. And I'll say, just because you're not in the FEMA floodplain, whether it's a riverine or coastal floodplain, doesn't mean you may not get flooded. Okay, there's a lot of stormwater flooding that occurs. There's a lot of flooding in urban areas that FEMA just has not mapped. If you have basements, you might have your own flooding that occurs periodically. So just because FEMA has published that 1% annual chance event floodplain doesn't mean that you may not get you won't get flooded. Okay, if you're not in that zone. Okay, and before I forget, I'll also mention that no matter where you live, you can buy flood insurance. Okay, you're required to buy it if you have a federally backed mortgage and you're in a floodplain. But that doesn't mean that if you're out of the floodplain, you can't buy it. You can buy it wherever you are, regardless. And I also mentioned that your renter's insurance does not cover floods. And also mentioned that flood insurance will cover dam failure as well. So if you have some communities, and I'll show you here in just a minute, they actually have published dam inundation areas. And you'll see in our community, especially, our dam inundation area is actually bigger than our floodplain. So our business may be in a dam inundation area, and we're not required to buy flood insurance, so we're not told to buy flood insurance, but we probably should buy flood insurance, okay, because we would be covered if that dam does fail. Or if there is a bigger than the 1% annual chance flood event that occurs, we will also be covered. So then there's also kind of weather-related things as well. So storms, snow, hail. We kind of have, sometimes we get a little forecast about that. So we can have a little preparation time maybe. Other times it just comes in quite quickly. But we have this kind of storm weather-related stuff that kind of impacts the whole area. There might be some areas that get heavier hail than others. But this is usually things that kind of impact the region. And we're going to have to deal with it, throughout the community. Then we might have wind-related things as well. So we might have tornadoes or straight line winds, derecho, hurricane winds as well. So if we mitigate for, let's say we put up our shutters for our hurricane winds, well, it'll also help with the straight line winds and derecho as well. So looking at, mitigating for one of these things could actually help us mitigate for others as well. We have earth movement, earthquake, landslide. We do get these, not as common as, let's say, the West Coast, but they do occur. There are a couple of seismic zones in Virginia. There's a Central Virginia seismic zone. There's also one in Southwest Virginia. So a lot of folks remember maybe the Louisa County, the mineral earthquake that occurred. But any earthquake, if it is like 5.0 or greater, is going to do some damage to our structures. The structures in Virginia are very susceptible to earthquakes. A lot of them are very susceptible to earthquakes. In the city where I live in Lynchburg, we have tons of brick buildings in the downtown, and they're very, very old. Very old, unreinforced masonry basically creates most of the casualties in the country when there's an earthquake. Okay, so all these old brick buildings, when they collapse, they cause a lot of casualties. So luckily we don't get the earthquakes, and that's why we have those buildings that have been standing for hundreds of years. But be knowledgeable that we are sometimes in very susceptible areas, and also looking at landslides, sinkholes. Those sorts of things can happen periodically as well. And there is some information. There's a couple of landslide databases that are available that we'll look at here. Pandemic, I think we're familiar with that one now, but pandemic is one that, we sort of have these natural hazards and then, human cause and technological hazards as well. And those can be more difficult to predict. They don't quite happen as often, but they can be high impact. We can also categorize these hazards by warning time. Some things we basically have no warning. It just occurs and we got to deal with it. And so that should be a consideration when you're looking at your plan and writing your plan. Then there's things that we have a short warning time. So it might be a forecast says, or tornado warning. So hopefully everyone on their smartphone, you've basically subscribe to your local emergency management agency's emergency warning system. So that's a warning that goes out, and you should take action. You're given maybe a little bit of warning. And there's other things that we have, more warning time. It could be a flood that occurs way upstream and takes maybe a day or two to come down, or hours, or it could be something like a wildfire that kind of moves slowly and takes over things. Or a snowfall event that's forecasted, 5 days out or so. So, this should be a consideration when looking at your plan as well. And then, some hazards require maps. We talked about the floodplains that we can view. This is one for Lynchburg here, and basically for some communities, a lot of the hazard maps are available online. So you can just kind of go in. You can actually, for things like flood, you can go to FEMA's website and type in your business address, and it'll tell you whether you're in the floodplain or not. Like I said, that's the 1% annual chance floodplain. But I think looking at a map can be definitely imperative for this process. Looking at not only your business, but also all those dependencies we talked about as well. The routes that you're taking. In this example here, we actually have a substation that's here next to the river that may be impacted in a major flood or inundation event. So I should make a note of that. That my business may not be flooded, but if the substation goes underwater, then I'm not going to have electricity. So what am I going to do there? So, maps are pretty important with some of these hazards to kind of figure out what the impacts are going to be. And then like I said, other hazards kind of impact the whole area. Some areas that may be higher elevation might get more snow. And then also looking at, for snow or ice, if I have a lot of hilly areas in the region, I might not be able to use transportation to get to places as well. So that could be an impact. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump into the resource guide that we provided. And so let's see here. So if you're outside Central Virginia, if you're in Virginia here, there is this, what Virginia has done is they've basically broken up the state into planning districts. Okay, so the planning districts basically work together to write the hazard mitigation plan. So you'll have several counties and probably a city and several towns kind of working together to write these mitigation plans. And within those plans, they actually address each town and locality in them. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just click on this link here. And it's going to bring up the planning district inventory here. So if you are trying to figure out what planning district you belong to, there's a link to them here. So you'll see you have counties and towns here. So if you're in one of these counties or towns, you can click on the link and it'll take you to the planning district. Okay, so this is the one that I live in Central Virginia. I can click on that and I can get to my Planning District Commission website. Okay, but so I know a lot of you are from around the state, and you can basically find your information there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at mine specifically. And ours is actually being updated. We're finalizing it right now. And depending on where you live, this plan, it has to be updated basically every 5 years. And so different planning districts have different schedules. So I know Richmond, I think, is working on theirs next year. There's a couple of others. Danville's working on theirs currently, I believe. So there's different schedules. And so basically each person has kind of their own hazard mitigation plan. So here's our hazard mitigation website, and eventually there'll be a link to the plan itself here. Okay, so here's the old one in place. So what I'm going to do is just kind of open up my local mitigation plan here. And you'll see I've got this button here to access the plan. So I can look at the mitigation plan by clicking on this. In Central Virginia, we also have maps here that are available to us as well. So let me just click on that. And your community may have this as well. The planning district may have it, or the city may have it in their GIS. But you'll see someone has actually already gone through and they've characterized these hazards for us. So they've looked at things like flooding or tornado touchdowns or dam safety. And what I can do is I can download the map as a PDF, or I can actually go in and do an interactive map here. So what I can do is kind of zoom down to where my business sits. Okay, and I can start to look at some of the flooding impacts and that sort of thing. And it actually calls out some of the things that are basically in the floodplain. So if certain things are in the floodplain, we have our children's museum is in the floodplain here. And some of the businesses are called out here, but there's some electrical substations as well that may be of interest. But let me, it's already 10:15 and I want to take a little break here. So before I get into the mitigation plan itself, I was just going to take a little break, I think just a 5-minute break. So what we'll do is we'll take 5 minutes. We'll start back up at 10:20. Okay, I'm going to start back up. Okay, so so to go back to what I was talking about, each community will have this hazard mitigation plan. Your planning district commission, your PDC, will provide they're required by law to give it to the public, so it'll be publicly available on their website. And you'll be able to basically go in. It might be just a big PDF document. The one here in Central Virginia, they actually broke it up by chapters, which is what I'm looking at right now, is the contents of that mitigation plan. And these are pretty similar in layout. They're required to have a risk assessment in them. Okay, so the community has already gone through and they've identified all these hazards that could impact the community, and they've basically identified which ones are more likely to impact. They have sort of high risk hazards they've identified. They've gone through the historical information and have characterized all these hazards. And they also started to look at critical assets in the community. So if the community has utilities or fire or police station, emergency operations center that could be impacted, is susceptible to a specific hazard, they will call it out in this plan. Okay, so if you didn't know, if you had a substation in the floodplain, this is where you would find it in this plan. So you'll see in the Central Virginia plan, they've got it basically set up by hazard. There's quite a few here that they looked at. And you can basically click on the hazard of interest, and there'll be detailed information on it. So I'm going to click on flooding here. This is one of the longer ones, but basically there'll be information on kind of defining what a flood is, some of the magnitude, severity. For all the hazards, they're going to basically look at the historical events that have occurred in your area, so you'll have an idea of what could occur. In this one, they have the floodplain information. They'll describe what the different FEMA floodplains actually mean. What is a zone A or what is a zone AH? So these are all defined. Like I said, the previous occurrences will also be in here. Different damages are here as well, okay, for our different counties and the city. And this is really just from 1996, so it's not a huge time frame. And they also have information on the impacts and the vulnerability. They talk about the National Flood Insurance Program. There's also something called this repetitive loss property. So if your property has had several flood events impact it, it'll be one of these repetitive loss properties, and the community will probably work with you to mitigate. They should. Okay, and then they get into the risk assessment where they start to look at the different impacts to the community. So the different critical facilities that are impacted, the structures that are impacted, any bridges that may be impacted, maybe there as well. I'm just going to skip through some of this. It's kind of technical. They actually do an impact assessment for the entire community and looking at what the economic impacts would be for a specific flood. So it's pretty detailed. Then they actually do a jurisdictional analysis. So each jurisdiction should be presented in the plan. So if you go to your specific town or city or county, they should have a specific section for that jurisdiction. And here they'll actually point out individual community issues for that particular hazard. So you'll see some of these utilities that are going to be impacted. Okay, there's actually a fire station that could be impacted from a flood. Natural gas line here. You have different bridges, 20 high-risk bridges that are impacted. And there might be some tables here that show where some of that information is. Okay, so here are those different utilities, and in this case, it's a museum that's impacted. Here's a power plant. Give the address there and the location. And here are some of the roads that are maybe impacted from the hazard. Okay, so there's a lot of detail here. Some plans are more detailed than others, but just takes a matter of kind of reading through this. You know, find a hazard that is interesting to you, that you think maybe impact your business, and kind of this is a great place to start because they've done a lot of research for you already. You know, some of this stuff can be pretty overwhelming. There's all these hazards that could impact you, but if a lot of that work's already been done and you're just kind of using it for your own purposes, you know, that's great. So this is a great base to start with. Kind of read through these hazard chapters and figure out, you know, if these things are impacted, is that going to impact my community or my business? And then actually going down, drilling down into your own business and seeing whether or not your business is maybe impacted as well. Okay, so here's the different bridges that may be impacted. Okay, and as I mentioned, there's one of these for each hazard. And at the end, they actually go through and they rank the hazards as well. So if you're not sure exactly what is more likely to occur, you kind of come through and say, okay, flooding is they decided is higher, drought in this situation might be higher, and fires as well. And fires occur all the time. I think in this region there's like 7 a day, basically on average. So that can be pretty likely in some areas, but the impact is really just, you know, a single structure, or it might be multiple structures. So you can kind of go through here and take a look at how they ranked them, and then think about how your business might rank them. You know, which ones are going to be have more impact to your own business, because that may not be what the community has decided is impacting the entire community as a whole. Um, so you kind of go through their process for how they rank things. They looked at kind of damages and losses uh, over a certain amount of time. All right, so that's the mitigation plan. The other parts of the mitigation plan here, there's information on the community itself, just some profile information on businesses in the community, the larger businesses, but also things on the demographics, the population of the communities are there. And then there's also a mitigation section too, which we'll talk about more in the next workshop. But the community has also identified mitigation actions that they have planned to take. And I think it's also beneficial for businesses to look at what the community is planning to do mitigation wise, to see how that may benefit themselves. And, this is a public process when they do this mitigation plan every 5 years. They are required by law to bring the public into the process. So you'll see things in your TV and your newspapers when they want public input. And I encourage all the planners who do these to involve businesses, local businesses, because it impacts them so much. So they should be bringing you into the process, and you should be able to provide input as well, as a small business to the process. Getting to know the lead planner in your area is a great idea, and then getting involved so that you can kind of see where the community is headed. And for major projects, you're going to need the community, the county, or the city to probably put in the grant application to do that major infrastructure project if that's what it is. And even if you're going to do something locally, there are grants out there to help businesses with mitigation. But in order for you to put in your grant application, you're going to work with these local planners, basically, the Planning District Commission planners, and then eventually the state is going to submit it on your behalf. So it's good to get in there and get to know those people. Let them know what your business is about and what you're concerned about. I think it'd be great if you all did your own, risk assessments and mitigation plans, and show that you're committed to doing this as well. And there's also a section on implementation and maintenance. So how are the mitigation measures that the community has defined? How are those going to be implemented there locally? And then, for our maintenance, we're meeting every 6 months. So if they tell you, if there's a mitigation committee that you could be part of or at least call into, I think that would be beneficial as well if this is something of interest to you. And then, also with that mitigation plan, if you see that your mitigation plan is about to expire for your community, let them know that, hey, send them an email and say, what happens is if it expires, then no one in the community is eligible for grant money for hazard mitigation. So in our community here in Lynchburg, ours expired, I think about 2 years ago or so. So it's a big problem, and if you're pushing them to keep it up to date, that's a great thing to do. So one thing we talked about climate change a little bit, but I got a couple slides here on some statewide projections for climate in Virginia. There's a couple of websites like Climate Central where you can go and you can kind of see the statewide projections, and you can kind of see this. This example is showing from 1970 to 2015. Kind of we have this upward trend, and I know a lot of some folks might not acknowledge climate change at this point, but I do tend to kind of show them these sorts of charts. This is data that's collected. This is not projection, and you can kind of see the trend, the upward trend here for the state. And if you look at the climate models for Virginia, they all show the temperature is increasing. Now the precipitation, some models show more precipitation in the future, some show less, but the temperature models are all showing increase in temperature. And this is what it looks like for sea level rise. This is actually off of Virginia, and NOAA has their tides and currents website that you can go to, and they have tidal information that they've collected, in this case back from 1960, and you can kind of see the sea level rising there. We're at 2020 now. You can see that black line there in the slide that shows our increase in sea level for tidewater area. And then here's the different projections, the climate projections for the area as well. Depending on what the future looks like. So, sea level is going to be is definitely happening as well. That sea level change is increasing. So if you are in the tidewater area, if you're in the coastal area, this is definitely going to impact you. And then also observe the projected temperature changes, depending on what scenario we look at, depending on whether we just kind of go about business as usual, or we actually start to take some initiative to lower those emissions. So we've got our projected temperature change here. You can kind of see the upward trend. And then we have our models here as well. And some of the mitigation plans, they do touch on climate change. They're not required by FEMA to do that, but some communities have actually done it already. And then also the more extreme runoff projected. This is also for Virginia. Different, we have so many flow events in the state, and those flow events look like they're increasing. So we may have similar precipitation on an annual basis here in the state, but the water may all fall at once. Okay, so we may get flooding and then no water at all for extended periods of time, and going into kind of drought conditions. So although if we look at it on an annual basis, it may look not so bad, but when you start to look at what these climate models are saying, it's showing that in some cases, we may end up actually with the water coming all at once. So how are we going to kind of deal with that in our communities? And of course, the heat waves as well. Those are projected to increase. So our 10 or 12 heat days a year are going to increase to like a month of that. So how are we going to deal with that? Some communities are setting up cooling centers and that sort of thing. And actually some folks, some community members, general public they actually go to businesses and to cool off. They prefer to go to like a Walmart instead of a cooling center, so they can at least do some shopping or look around instead of sitting in a business all day, looking at the wall or whatever. So that may impact business as well. If you've got something that's bringing in folks for cooling, maybe a positive for you all. Yeah, this is pretty major. In some areas, there's just no air conditioning. Some neighborhoods just don't have air conditioning, and so making sure that those vulnerable people are protected. And then we've got common climate models here. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but it is a way to kind of simulate these interactions between the atmosphere and the oceans, the land surface, ice. There are all these variables that go into, millions of variables that go into these climate models that produce these changes in temperature and precipitation over time. There's a couple of the big ones that get used for a lot of the planning, include NOAA's models. We have some from the UK here. There's also one that was created for the public, actually. So different climate models going on. These different scenarios, kind of the four major ones, are driven by economic conditions, global versus regional conditions, and then whether it's going to be a kind of a pro environment, and all these driving forces, whether it's the population, the economy, the energy that we use, are all driving these different climate models. So that's when we show those projections. We have kind of these worst case scenarios and then kind of these better conditions if we do start looking more at the environment. So it's going to be up to you to kind of look at your business and figure out, what's my hazard of concern. Looking at your mitigation plan that we just looked at, trying to figure out your own workspace. Do you have this brick and mortar business that you're running, or is it more of a home business? I think that came up in the chat. If you're a home business, you still got to think about what's going to impact you as a home business as well. And maybe that'll help you with your, you and your family as well, if you have a plan for them. Evaluate the site around the workplace as well. And then looking at those dependencies. We looked at this already, the mitigation plan, and we saw that there's a ranking procedure for that plan. When we do our workspace assessment, there are different characteristics of our structure that make us more vulnerable to hazards. So for things like a flood, it's the foundation type. So does our building have a basement? Okay, if we do have a basement, do we keep stuff there? I've seen some restaurants keep foodstuffs and kegs and that sort of thing in a basement that was in a floodplain. Or are you just not using that space at all? Your lower elevations are going to be impacted by a flood first. And if you're built up, if you're walking 4, 5, 6 steps to get to your business, okay, you might be elevated high enough to be out of the floodplain. Wind can be, roof type or window types, whether you have shutters, your doors, if your door pulls in versus pushes out. Okay, if it pulls in, it's not going to be it's going to be more susceptible to wind damage. With the wind damage, it's really a matter of keeping your building envelope and making sure you don't lose your windows or your doors. Because once that happens, then all the forces act on your roof. That force doubles and you end up losing your roofing as well. Then we talked about earthquake susceptibility already, based on kind of that year built, older buildings. The building code in place didn't really have earthquake considerations at all. Building type as well, that unreinforced masonry is not very good. Really tall buildings too don't fare so well in earthquakes. Urban fire as well could be year built in your environments, and then pandemic, looking at your spaces. Some places are just more susceptible to pandemic. If you have a lot of people near each other and not able to space them out, then you got some issues there. And then looking at your insurance as well, I mentioned this a little bit already, but making sure you know what your insurance covers. If you're using renter's insurance to cover everything, it may not be good enough. And really, insurance is, you're transferring your risk. You're not actually reducing. You're still going to have impacts. You're just transferring that risk to other people, a pool of people. And then site assessment as well. So proximity to hazard zones. You may not be paying flood insurance because you're not in a floodplain, but your parking lot may be in a floodplain, or the road to get to your business may be in a floodplain, and so that's going to impact you as well. So looking at your site, proximity to hazardous materials as well. So that information is available to the public. Businesses that maintain hazardous materials, it's in our mitigation plans. It's also EPA produces it on their websites. And then looking at your environment, are you in that urban woodland interface that is very susceptible to wildfire and that sort of thing? So that could be an issue too. Okay, and then operational dependencies. Looking at there's utilities we talked about already. There's routes. Water is a big one. Electricity. And basically, we've got our 2 worksheets left, and this is basically as you fill this out, this will help give you some recommendations. So as I fill it out here on the top, my workspace assessments, what sort of building do I have, site assessments, and I know some of this may not be applicable to all businesses, but if you have a structure that and it could be your home if it's a home-based business, there'll be some recommendations that pop up as you populate this worksheet for the hazards to focus on. And like I mentioned, also look at your hazard mitigation plan. And so these hazards should say, you know, yes or no here, whether you're going to focus on it for your own plan. And then what we're trying to get to is trying to determine the magnitude of the issue. So how bad can it get? Like how much is at risk for loss for my business? How many employees are going to be impacted? So that's kind of what you're trying to get to, and that's what we're trying to get to in the third worksheet. And what you'll look at in some of the references in that worksheet, there's actually they try to quantify some of this loss, and so these things like these are called damage functions, and they require depth of flooding or wind speeds, and they generate a loss to the structure as well as to the contents in that structure. And what happens is after each event, the Army Corps of Engineers goes out and they do a bunch of inspections, they gather a lot of data, and they create these damage functions that we can use to figure out what sort of loss there's going to be. And those are provided in your worksheet. You'll see there's a flood reference, a dam breach reference, a wind reference. So if you can kind of figure out what sort of flood you might expect if flood or wind is your issue. Looking at that mitigation plan to see what sort of wind speeds you might expect in your community. Those references will help you figure out kind of what sort of damage to expect. And this is what this third worksheet is about, is trying to quantify that risk. So looking at your mitigation plan to figure out how many times has this hazard occurred and over how many years has that occurred. You plug that information here and it gives you this calculated probability of occurrence. And then looking at your structural damage and your interior damage, and it might be 100%. If you have a tornado, that could be 100% damage right there, or some massive, hazard, or it may not be any structural damage. It could be a pandemic. It could be a drought that doesn't do any structural damage. So that could be zeros as well, depending on your hazard. So we've got this for, I think, 3 different hazards here, but you can just copy that and paste it if you want to look at other hazards. It's set up to do that. And so what this does is it's going to go through, and depending on what you plug in these green areas, the gray areas will be calculated for you. And so depending on what you plug in for worksheet number 1 and 2, it'll start taking that information and it'll start to figure out what your direct loss may be and what your business interruption loss may be. And if you're when we start looking at these total losses, the business owner loss is of course very important, but there may be other losses as well, like the landlord loss. If you're a renter, when you start to look at mitigation, when you do a mitigation strategy, you want to include as many losses as you can, because that, when you start to mitigate those things, you'll see a greater benefit with your mitigation, and that will, if you decide to do a grant application, you'll have to do a benefit cost analysis. And this is the process. You'll be kind of ahead of the game because you'll have done this process already, and you'll have kind of the first step to it completed. And so what we're trying to do is get to kind of this total loss value for an event. So in this case, maybe it's $155,000 loss, pretty substantial loss. And then what we do is we actually analyze that loss. So as a business, I'm going to lose $1,500 a year due to flooding if I built my retail store in the floodplain and I get this sort of damage. So by analyzing that loss, this is where we start to get into the next step of mitigation, and we'll use that as an input to our mitigation in the next workshop. But this is basically the 3 worksheets for this first course. And like I said, we're trying to get to this overall loss and help you kind of figure out where your losses are going to occur. Now, this is solely kind of economic, but again, you still have the impacts to people, the impacts potentially to the natural environment that you should also identify here. So I think we're going to leave a little bit of time for questions and that sort of thing. So we got about maybe 10 minutes left.
Fantastic. So, Bill, as you've been going through this, I have been monitoring the chat box and screening out some questions. A few questions came into me privately as well. The first one is around supply chain. If a company is really dependent on a specific farm for their restaurant or a specific garment manufacturing for their retail store, can they use a model like this to help understand where the risk in their supply chain might be?
Yes. So for the oh, okay. Yeah. So for the supply chain, you can use an approach like this. What you would do is take a look at. You have to gather some information on those suppliers. So where are they located? How do the things actually get to you? And start to map that out in these worksheets as well. So if it's a specific location, building in that location, you can do kind of an assessment at that location and then the route to you. Or if it's multiple locations, identifying those, and it might take some additional work, depending on how many suppliers you have, to figure out kind of what the impacts to those businesses might be and the likelihood of that occurring. So you could use approach, but again, it's going to take a little bit of additional research on your end.
Excellent. So the next question that a couple of people sent was around internet access. How do you assess the vulnerability of your internet? Is there a map somewhere people can go? Because I think a lot of businesses are reliant on internet for their credit card processing and for their retail stores. Is it based just on, think back over the last 5 years, how frequently does your internet go out, or is there some external place we can find this information?
Yeah, that's a good one too. So with internet, part of it is, doing that. You're kind of profiling the hazard just like you do the other hazards, but you're looking at, okay, how often do I lose internet? And if it's at a level that's okay, then maybe you're okay. But if you're finding that you're losing it quite often, or maybe it's at a time when it's just not acceptable, it's identifying. I guess we'll talk about this in the next workshop, but identifying kind of what is the process to maybe you're finding that you lose it during certain storm events, or maybe it's just going out because there's construction on the road, or maybe it's going out just periodically for no apparent reason. But there's also nothing that says you can't call your provider and say, hey, I'm a small business. Your internet is crucial to my needs. What are you all doing to help me, make sure I have internet? If it's, and maybe working with them on a better solution, or trying to, or I'm sure they probably have a lot of statistics for you. If you're like just getting new internet and you don't maybe know how often you're going to lose it, they probably have some statistics on how often they lose it for your area neighborhood, and that might figure into your mitigation plan, and figuring out what you can do if you do lose internet. What is the option there? Can I use my cell phone? There's satellite now, I guess, if you have the funding to do it that way. Yeah.
Excellent. There are a couple of questions, and we have a number of people on the call who are home-based businesses, and they're interested about how that works with the availability to apply for mitigation grants, and whether or not there's anything special about how home-based businesses should think about interacting with their planning commission or their planning district commission?
Yeah, so home-based businesses, I guess the good news is they are eligible for grants as well. I mean, even homeowners without a business are eligible as well as businesses. So that shouldn't impact whether or not you can seek funding. But I think still, you know, I think you'd be surprised at how few people actually get involved with the planning process. I've been involved in dozens of these across the country, and most people just totally ignore it. So I think even if if you think you have a small business and you're just out of your home, I think just getting in there and being an advocate is going to be very beneficial. I've never been in a situation where there's been too many businesses that show up for these planning events. So I think you should still show up and tell them what you're about, and I mean, even as a resident, you should be interested in that for your own homes and families.
Here in Lynchburg, we have just gone through our own hazard mitigation plan is just being done, and they did a bunch of different open stakeholder meetings that were open to the public. I went to one of them, and I was the only sort of resident business person there. Everyone else was a city employee or a district employee. So I will just echo what Bill is saying here, that this is an area where you as a small business can have a disproportionately powerful voice, because when not very many people are showing up and you do, you have a lot of sway and a lot of influence. Yes, so I think we are at the end of our time. Bill, I just want to go over and make sure everyone understands the homework. So if I understand correctly, their job is to look up their local, regional hazard mitigation plan, using that directory as a starting place. Use that as inspiration to fill out the worksheets, but that they shouldn't, that they need to sort of put their thinking caps on, that if they know that their parking lot always floods, maybe they want to bump up what the plan, the hazard mitigation says. If they know that they've had massive damage, if they know that their roof is particularly old, that they can tweak sort of the inputs into their worksheet to customize it for their operation.
Yes, definitely. Yes. Yeah, definitely just use the worksheet as inspiration. Feel free to customize it for however your business works. But yeah, look at your local mitigation plan, take a look at it, and see what the local community is saying. There are some other links too in that resource guide. I didn't go through all of them, but there's some national ones as well where you could kind of plug in your address and see what you might be at risk to. So feel free to go through those other resources as well.
So I think that that covers all the questions that came in through the chat box. It looks like we're out of time. Stephanie, I'm going to turn it over to you to close us out.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks, Bill, so much for leading us through this this great conversation and training this morning. I know I have a lot to think about, and I'm sure lots of our small businesses that have joined us today do as well, especially we're getting a little bit of rain right now. So I bet we're all going to watch how that flooding and the runoff works around our businesses this morning. We will have slides and the recording for today's session up soon. You will be getting an email from me with those items. As always, stay tuned for upcoming titles from the Virginia Small Business Development Center and the SBDC for the Lynchburg region. You can search for us on Facebook or go to the YouTube channel and take a look at all of the topics that we have there. They're really fantastic. And we will see you at 9 a.m. on October the 8th for the second part of this series. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks.